Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Brookings Doha Center panel on a very timely topic tonight on the U.S. Iranian tensions and the ramifications for this region, especially the Gulf region. I'm very delighted to moderate this night's event with such distinguished guests from Washington, Tehran, and Amman. I'm going to introduce them, each of them, before they will talk about 8 minutes in an opening statement. A few introductory remarks, although I'm sure that you're all well aware of the situation, but as you know, things quite escalated in the wake of the May 2018 U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the so-called Iran nuclear deal, after which the U.S. started a maximum pressure campaign against Iran with at its core a very stringent economic sanctions regime that severely impacted upon Iranian oil exports. Meanwhile, Europe failed to deliver on its promises to provide for economic relief for the Iranians. The Iranians, in response to that situation, proclaimed a maximum resistance strategy that also involved mostly well-calibrated actions in this region, although Tehran denied to be their perpetrator. And so what we have been witnessing over the past few weeks and months has been a risky game of brinkmanship between Iran and the US and its allies. So tonight, we're going to, with the help of our panelists, discuss some of the issues, whether we're going to see military confrontation between the sides or are we going to see rather negotiations. And what also is the role of foreign powers in mediating in the crisis. And what is actually US strategy? And what is Iranian strategy in all of that? So those are just a few of the topics to be discussed tonight. We're going to close at around 7:30. For the first half an hour, we're going to have the opening statements by each of the panelists. Later on, we're going to engage on a discussion on the panel. And last but not least, I'm very much looking forward to your questions in the last half an hour. So we welcome from Washington, D.C., Dr. Suzanne Maloney. She is the Deputy Director of Brookings Foreign Policy Program and also Senior Fellow in the Brookings Center for Middle East Policy and its Energy Security and Climate Initiative. She previously served as an external advisor to senior State Department officials on long-term issues related to Iran. Before joining Brookings, she was also working as a Middle East advisor for ExxonMobil, among others. Dr. Maloney is without doubt one of the most knowledgeable and one must say also caring U.S. Iran specialists who also made important contributions to the study of the political economy of post-revolutionary Iran. So for everyone following U.S. Iran relations, I would very much encourage to follow her very eloquent and insightful analyses. Welcome to Doha, Suzanne. The floor is yours.
Thank you to Ali, and thank you to Brookings Doha Center for organizing this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I have known Dr. Maliki for several decades now, which unfortunately dates us both, and I think gives you some sense of the durability of the issue and the animosity between the United States and Iran. I was lucky enough to be part of the first and only two post-revolutionary exchange programs that were supported by both governments. This was 20 years ago. We are, of course, now just in the year that marks the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, and we are almost on the precipice of the anniversary of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, which precipitated the breach in the relationship between the two countries and the hostility that has characterized the relationship between Washington and Tehran ever since then. And if you had asked me 20 years ago when I first was traveling to Iran, if in fact we would see another 2 decades of hostility between the two countries, I would have been very optimistic that in fact a solution could be found. Today, unfortunately, I come to you much more pessimistic. Perhaps that's a function of growing older. Perhaps it's a function of having watched the situation for the amount of time that I have. It's also, I think, a function of my concern that we have navigated ourselves, largely because of the policies of both governments, into a strategic impasse which won't be resolved easily and which is very prone to escalation from both sides. Let me say that much of my engagement in Washington involves efforts to try to explain and interpret Iranian policies and Iranian actions to American policymakers and to American audiences. I'm more familiar with the kind of clerical Kremlinology of the Islamic Republic than I am with trying to analyze our very interesting political situation in Washington today. But I understand, of course, that part of my responsibility, part of my contribution to this conversation is to try to explain how it is we have come to this set of circumstances in which only 4 years after the United States, Iran, and other world powers concluded a historic agreement which promised, if not to fully end, at least to durably defer one of the most urgent security crises facing the two countries and, of course, the region as a whole. The Iranian nuclear program and the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015, which was then, of course, implemented in early 2016, was the first significant diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and Iran since 1981, the agreement that solved and resulted in the freedom of the hostages who had been held in Iran after the seizure of the U.S. embassy there. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was the product of more than a dozen years of intensive diplomacy, not just by Tehran, not just by Washington, but even more importantly by these other world powers, and especially by the Europeans. It was 159 pages of intensely negotiated text that was the sum of an enormous amount of expert engagement on both sides. And it was seen, I think, very much as both the culmination of the first significant, serious bilateral diplomatic engagement between Washington and Tehran since the early revolutionary period, but also as the start of something that might, in fact, result in a broader rapprochement, or at least a warming of what had been a long, cold, and often very ugly war between the United States and Tehran. And of course, as you well know, whatever optimism accompanied that deal was quickly shattered, both by the frustrations that were expressed on both sides as the deal went into implementation. I'm sure Dr. Maliki can speak to it more eloquently than I, but of course, many Iranians felt as though they didn't receive the sanctions relief that they were promised, even before the Trump administration came into office. And there were, of course, many in Washington who were critical of the deal from its inception and who believed that what it resulted in was a Washington whose hands were tied. The ability to pressure Iran on all the other issues of concern essentially held hostage to this new nuclear deal. And so when the Trump administration came into office in early 2017, there were a lot of trepidations about the longevity of the deal, irrespective of the personality of our very unique and, let me be honest, very problematic president. President Trump understood from the earliest days of his campaign that Iran was an issue on which he could, in fact, reach out and speak to an American population that was inherently skeptical of diplomacy with Iran, an American electorate that didn't really understand the issues at stake, certainly didn't understand the 159 pages of carefully negotiated terms of the agreement. But he also understood it was an issue in which he had some resonance with the Republican establishment. And so when he came into office, he has had a rotating cast in his national security bureaucracy, We are, of course, on our 4th National Security Advisor, which is a record for an American president under this administration, our 2nd Secretary of State, and innumerable other changes. But there's been one consistent factor among all of the individuals that President Trump has selected and empowered since coming into office, is that they're very hawkish on Iran policy. That they subscribe to the view of, as I said, the establishment Republican position on the nuclear deal, which was the United States had given away too much and received too little, that the terms of the deal were far too favorable to Iran, that they essentially permitted Iran to continue its nuclear program, to retain the right to enriching uranium, and simply to defer some of its activities until such time as it could launch a much more aggressive and more sophisticated program with more advanced centrifuges that could move much more quickly toward nuclear weapons capability. And they were, of course, quite critical of the deal because it addressed only the nuclear program, notwithstanding the fact that that was clear throughout those dozen years of diplomacy. There was never really a serious prospect that those negotiations were going to be broadened, despite some efforts on both sides to contemplate that. It was always seen as purely a nuclear deal, and if you look at everything the Obama administration said to defend it and to advocate on its behalf, they were very clear that this was not going to be a wholesale solution or a rapprochement between the two countries, but it was a starting point. President Trump, of course, came into office and began a systematic effort to unravel the deal as he sought other initiatives to put pressure on Iran. One of the first things the Trump administration did after entering office was to impose a visa ban on a number of countries. It became known as the Muslim ban. I often call it the Iran ban, because Iran was the largest country, the largest number of entrants to the United States who were impacted by that ban. And there were a number of other measures that were taken by the president up until 2018, when he in fact announced that the United States would withdraw from the deal. And we are now living with the fallout from that decision. It was a decision that was undertaken despite some efforts on European powers' part to try to accommodate the Trump administration's criticisms of the deal, to try to find a new diplomatic pathway to building on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which frankly was always the intent of Democrats had they in fact taken the White House in 2016. No one believed that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was sufficient unto itself as a diplomatic mechanism for dealing with the nuclear program, or certainly not any of the other concerns and differences between the two countries. But of course, the president is not a man of details. He is not a man who can claim to really understand the technical aspects or even the strategic implications of Iran's nuclear activities. And he was interested, I think, mostly in the headlines and mostly in the outreach to our American security partners in the region, who were also quite critical of the deal. Most notably, of course, Israel and Saudi Arabia, long-time and very vociferous critics of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and of the Obama administration's outreach to the deal. What we've seen since President Trump's decision in 2018 to walk away from the deal is both success and failure. Success in the sense that no one really understood if American sanctions implemented unilaterally would have a very significant effect. What had been tried before suggested that unilateral sanctions are not very useful. And only with the support of the international community, particularly between 2010 and 2013, was the Obama administration really able to apply catastrophic economic pressure to Iran. But that misunderstood the nature of the way sanctions have evolved as a tool over the course of the past 20 years. And in particular, the massive new authority that was given to the United States Treasury Department in the wake of the 9/11 attacks to pursue counter-terror financing was utilized to target financing for nuclear proliferation and was essentially utilized to cut off Iran from the international financial system. That was the primary reason why the sanctions were effective under the Obama administration, and it proved equally effective under the Trump administration, even without the active support and in many cases with the active opposition of much of the rest of the world. Iran, for its part, exercised, as Ali said, strategic patience during the first year, which was a remarkable thing. And of course, the cataclysmic expectations of those of us who supported the deal, who criticized the Trump White House for walking away as it did, proved somewhat overstated, at least in the beginning. All that changed once again in May of this year. On the anniversary of his decision to walk away, to exit the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, President Trump announced that he would in fact try to use the American sanctions to drive Iran's oil exports to zero. And within a mere span of a few days, about 10 days' time, we saw the beginnings of a very deliberate and frankly very effective campaign of pushback from Tehran, targeting small ships in the Gulf, targeting the mechanisms, the workarounds that had been established to try to mitigate the vulnerabilities of Iran's access to the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. So they targeted, there was sabotage inflicted upon the Saudi East-West pipeline, which enabled the Saudis to avert the Strait of Hormuz, as well as the port of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. All of this culminated in July with the shoot-down of an American surveillance drone, and with President Trump's shocking decision to many not to retaliate, and not only not to retaliate through military strikes, but to announce and explain his decision to do so on Twitter in a way that I would have to say is unprecedented and unique. I think this was an opportunity for Tehran to test what the American reaction to its pushback would be through these small-scale attacks and through the reaction to the downing of the drone. And then, of course, we saw another escalation in September with a very precise and very deliberate escalation in the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais. What we have seen through this is the capability of Iran to make good on the threats that its leadership has articulated since the 1980s, since the devastating war between Iran and Iraq, when Iranian leaders said, if we can't export our oil, the rest of the region will not be safe to export its oil. They've been able to make good on that. And it's been effective in that it has helped generate much greater international urgency, new diplomatic initiatives by the French, and even more effort by the Trump administration, by President Trump himself, to try to find some avenue out of the mess that he has in fact created himself for some face-to-face diplomacy with his counterpart, President Rouhani, when he visited New York around the United Nations General Assembly meetings in September. I want to close with just a few comments about where I think this crisis is going. As I said, I believe we have a strategic impasse. The sanctions are effective. They have been devastating for the Iranian economy, even if Iran has managed through this crisis. There has been very little blowback on the United States or on the global economy. Even the attack on Abqaiq ratcheted up the price of oil only briefly, and it immediately went back down. And this is a result of the changing energy markets and the new production that has come online from the United States. So from Washington's perspective, we can continue this policy indefinitely, which means that the only real constraint is what Iran does, how Iran escalates, both with respect to its activities across the region and with respect to the steps that it is taking on a 60-day basis to roll back and to begin to step away from its own commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We are approaching yet another deadline and yet another moment in which Iran's decisions will determine where this crisis goes. And unfortunately, I see very little capacity or intent from the Trump administration itself to embark on the very difficult process of trying not just to revert to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but to negotiate a new platform for addressing the serious differences between the United States and Iran. And I see real incentive on the part of Tehran to continue to up the ante, to continue to demonstrate that there will be a price to be paid for this American maximum pressure strategy. And as a result, I'm more pessimistic today than I've ever been about the prospects of negotiations, serious negotiations between the United States and Iran.
Thank you, Suzanne, for this very good and concise overview since the conclusion of the JCPOA till today. I think it's a very useful background. So the next speaker is, I'm very delighted to have him here from Tehran, Dr. Abbas Maleki, who is currently an associate professor in energy policy, as well as the vice president for cultural and international affairs at Tehran's Sharif University of Technology, that is also known as the Iranian MIT. He was also a research scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and at the Center for Iranian Studies at MIT, also known as the American Sharif, if I may say so. He is also the chairman of the International Institute for Caspian Studies. And last but not least, Dr. Maleki was Iran's deputy foreign minister from 1980 to 1997. Welcome to Doha.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to thank Ali and the Brookings Institute in Doha for inviting me to this gathering, esteemed gathering. I prepared some slides in the PowerPoint model to present my thought about the Iran and United States relations as an engineer does in Sharif University or MIT. But I will talk about some of the slides very briefly in the few minutes. First, I must talk about 40 years of mutual hostility between the United States and Iran have severed to strongly enforce negative perceptions and suspicions on both sides. But it is very strange that in Iranian sides there is not a little hostility to United States. If you remember, after the 11th of September in 2001, Iranian also, they did some sympathy to the victims of the case of the New York and Washington attacks, and they went to the many vigils. And in other issues also, the Iranians, they show that they don't have problem with the United States culture, art, the case of technology, sciences, and especially higher education. But misperception and ignorance on both sides can affect policy making and unnecessary close off policy options. In the government and administration of both countries, there are many misperceptions. I did a model for myself about the Iran-US relations. I want to talk, the one side is using coercive diplomacy and another side uses deterrence diplomacy. The deterrence is a strategy to dissuade the opponents to undertake an action, as you know. And as Alexander George said, the coercive diplomacy is a strategy to persuade for stopping, undoing, or making changes, and action has already been initiated. I want to say United States, US uses coercive diplomacy even when United States talks about the negotiation talks, sitting to reach to agreement. The Americans, they want to put pressure on Iranian side to, for example, and threaten them to do something. They want to say to Iranian side in talks that we want to attack to Iran, as we received many times in different talks between Iran and United States. One example is Iraq invasion to Kuwait was an unsuccessful example of coercive strategy by United States. The coercive diplomacy was initiated by United Nations Security Council in front of Iraqi government, and then United Nations Security Council passed several resolutions that first imposed economic sanctions on Iraq, While the coercive diplomacy did not succeed, at last, United States forces launched a full-scale war against Iraqi forces. But in Iranian side, especially radicals in Tehran, they believe that the deterrence model best describes the current relationship between the United States and Iran. Their adherence to this view has had a significant effect on U.S. and Iran policy, foreign policy. Even where negotiations might succeed, Iranians are often undermined by threats. On the Iranian side, it is reflected in the supreme leaders oft made statements that the United States offers to negotiate over the Iranian nuclear program are not made in good faith, and it masks an American effort to make Iran subordinate to American power, as it was before Iranian Revolution in 1979. The United States also talks about the carrot and stick in Iran's when Americans they want to do something about Iran. Throughout Washington, Iran is typically treated as an implacable, hostile state that will only respond to coercion. They believe in Washington that with only few notable exceptions, United States efforts at engagement with Iran have been infrequent and half-hearted. When engagement is pursued, as it had been with respect to Iran's nuclear program, the American negotiating stance has been inflexible. At the same time, in belief that the Iranians cannot be expected to negotiate in good faith unless they are simultaneously threatened with coercive measures. Therefore, Washington has followed a carrot and stick approach. After decades of tough rhetoric and public statements about the need for coercive policy in the American case, or the need to demonstrate resolve and fairness in the Iranian case, American and Iranian leaders have very little leeway in how they may approach one another and are afforded little political space for flexibility. But in other side, Iran defense, the pressure is counterproductive most of the time. Iran believes when a country desires to protect itself against attacks, the threats heighten the perceived danger. This reality is able to describe why Iran's foreign minister clearly defends ballistic missile tests in front of press conference. Even Mr. Zarif also defends ballistic missile test in Iran because Iran cannot survive without defense system. Despite all of this issue, a key driver behind Iran's return to the negotiation table was to avoid the threat of another bloody war, not the U.S. coercive diplomacy as the United States and Washington, they interpreted it. The Iranians have been given no reason to believe that they would receive significant sanction relief in return for concessions, and thus they have lacked an incentive to concede. The framing of this issue, also I am discussing in my article, is to preserve the status quo. Both countries, Iran and United States, they believe that a status quo is the best situation. United States because of the access to the Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates. Iran has proxy neighbors and the proxy forces like Hezbollah, Iraqi government as a friend for Iran, for Tehran, the case of Syrian government, Mr. Bashar Assad, and also in Palestine, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. These are people, Iran has expansionist ambitions. framing United States, Iran as expansionist ambitions country, ballistic missile, nuclear program, relationship with Assad, Hezbollah and Hamas, closer ties with Russia and China. And the last one, Russia and China, it is very important because all of 200 years, the recent 200 years, Iranian trade was, majority of Iranian foreign trade were with the West, European countries and North American countries. But because of American pressure now, Iranian trade are positive with China, Russia, and India. This is the case with United States. The false decision-making in Washington caused Iran to shift from Western countries to Eastern countries. Framing 2 from Tehran, dispute is the same. Countries' nuclear program, security of Persian Gulf, U.S. military involvement in the region. But Iran describes itself as a championing of the status quo. United States says status quo is good because the soldiers are here, and Iran think it is championing the status quo and views the United States as the revisionist power. United States says Iran is expansionist. Iran says United States is a revisionist power and a regional interloper. U.S. opposition to Iran's civilian nuclear program stems from an American effort to deny Iran advanced technological know-how. This is very important, especially in Sharif University of Technology. United States tried to ignore all of the advanced technologies which Iran had been done during the years, 20 to 40 years. All of them they ignored. I don't want to talk about a spiral model with Robert Jervis talk about this case. A consequence of mutually reinforcing views is that when both sides of dispute believe falsely that the other will best respond to coercive threats, positive inducement will invite greater aggression, and it raises daily. A spiral model says United States and Iran, both of them, they think that the other is threatening every day, and therefore they must do something against. And both of them, they are custodian to the status quo. There are two recent events which are important, and Susan talked about one of them. One of them is the case of the tankers, British tankers, Stena and Pearl detained in Persian Gulf, but right after that Iranian oil tanker Grace 1 stopped by Royal Marines in Gibraltar. Iranian fired at U.S. MQ-9 drone monitoring Persian Gulf, and Iran oil tanker was attacked in Red Sea. At the same time, Hassan Rouhani, president of Islamic Republic, says the Hope or Hormuz peace endeavor initiated by Iran in the recent United Nations General Assembly invited all regional countries to that initiative for bringing peace and stability to the region. The second event was Macron initiative. G7 did a meeting in Biarritz in August 2016, 2019, and they shared a statement about Iran that to ensure that Iran never acquires nuclear weapons and to foster peace and stability in the region. Unprecedentedly, Mr. Zarif, Iranian foreign minister, went to Biarritz on August 26, and then in New York, Macron continued his efforts to do rapprochement between Iran and U.S. He tried to arrange a meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Rouhani even though they did not meet or phone call in New York, but important progress has been made on a substantive framework for possible talks and overcoming mistrust. And I can say the French initiative remains the only game in town. And the last issue is that I propose some ways which is forward. First, identifying and emphasizing common interests and values. Iran and United States, they have both a lot of common values, great cultural, scientific, and political exchange. Really, we don't know what is happening in Washington, and we need to know more about Congress, congressmen, and women. And third, establishing direct lines of communication and enhanced diplomatic channels. Fourth, using of confidence-building measures. It is very important, especially on the sea. And fifth, policy change and the think tank roles. The lessons from India-United States relations. I want to say that in Iran there is an Institute for Political and International Studies, which I established it in 1980, and it is working very hard. I think the track 2 diplomacy and relations between ICIS in Washington, IPIS in Tehran, and something like that maybe foster the case of rapprochement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maliki. As you all figured out, it has been more than 8 minutes each for so far. Last but not least, we welcome from Amman, Mr. Omar Ayasra, who is a Jordanian journalist and political analyst. His op-eds have appeared in several Jordanian and Turkish media outlets, including TRT Arabic. He is also the host of a political talk show on Al Yarmouk TV, which is a Jordanian station, and is regularly commenting on regional events for the Arabic services of Al Jazeera and the BBC. Mr. Ayasra, the floor is yours. Of course, you can also, I mean, if you speak not that long, you're going to have more time later on, I promise.
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I'm going to speak in Arabic. I'm going to take 8 minutes. I have listened attentively to what my colleagues have said in their interventions, and I had things in mind to say, but I want to say now that the Iranian-American conflict is very strange indeed. You would feel that Abbas and Suzanne should maybe continue with the story. When you think about, when you look into this conflict, so Iran, after 40 years of blockade, it was able to achieve a geostrategic kind of advancement, and it was able to get very strong tools in Yemen, in Syria, and also was able to confront the different battles, and it was able to reach the outcomes it wanted to reach in Lebanon, and the biggest prize was in Iraq. So when we talk about this, what is the reason? Is it due to the capabilities, or is it the nature of the blockade that was imposed on the Iranians, that is dealing without crushing the Iranians? When they dealt with the Saddam Hussein regime, they dealt with the tools of crushing the regime, but this did not apply to the Iranians. So this conflict is very particular indeed. It has its own methods and ways that Iranians and the Americans know. So after the withdrawal from the nuclear deal, this made the Iranians very much convinced that there is not going to be any battle nor a comprehensive war in the region. But for us to be much more fair, both speakers did not mention Israel. Israel is one of the most important players in this scene. Why has it been not mentioned by our Iranian brother? And one of the things that make Americans think and feel concerned and would use its soldiers, the most important factor is Israel and the security of Israel. This is something that should be understood. The withdrawal from the nuclear deal is not only in the interest of the U.S., but also in the interest of Israel. So many, when they were inciting, they were talking about Ibn Salman, the crown prince, and also about John Bolton and Israel. So this conflict that is happening between both the U.S. and Iran, I think it is going to lead to negotiations. The situation is not going to continue as it is happening now, because Iran is being subjected to very, very difficult kind of sanctions. Iran has so many neighboring countries that would enable it to overcome the sanctions, but it is suffering, and Iranians is not going in any way going to accept to surrender to what is happening. The Iranians are not going to accept to have the situation of Shah repeated. They are not going to accept to be toppled in front of their people as a result of the sanctions. The strategic patience is limited, so they are practicing three strategies, which is tampering with navigation and also aggression on tankers, and also Yemen and aggression against Saudi Arabia. And the third thing is to do with the oil enrichment and also the period of 2 months. So at the end of the day, if there is a comprehensive war, if the Iranians reach a point where this is going to lead to the toppling of the regime, the Iranians are not going to keep patient. Iranians understand that. Iranians understand that Trump is changing, and the main Arab powers, they do not know that. And the question that should be posed now, and that is posed in the different literatures, is the strategy, is it changing of the U.S., or is it only Trump? Is Trump doing that on his own, or is it the whole American strategy? Is this a kind of reformulation of the strategies in the region? So when we were at the beginning of this political life, we were asking questions: what would make the United States of America be interested in this region, in Kuwait, Beirut, and so on and so forth? And now the oil issue is not very clear. To what extent is America going to defend its allies? To what extent it is going to be ready to defend its allies, similar to what had happened during the Kuwait era? So does it mean that Trump is out of context of what is happening? I think Iranians have the ability to understand the limits of the threats made by Trump, and up until the elections, Iranians are very comfortable, and maybe after the elections, things are going to change. But I think that there is a push forward from both the Iranians and the Americans, and both parties know that the ultimate outcome is going to be dialogue, and they're going to reach to settlements if matters mature. So all indicators in the region show that this is going to lead to negotiations. Arabs, how do they see the matter? We, as Arabs, we see things in an unclear way. We neither go with the Iranians nor with the Americans. We do not know where to head, really. And the GCC is divided when it comes to dealing with Iran. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates had a position, and perhaps they wanted to break the tools of Iran and maybe lead matters into a comprehensive kind of confrontation. But Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman perhaps were much more rational, were more into pacification and maybe to halt the push forward by the U.S. and other countries. So what would we think about? What are the countries of the region going to think about? Now they're thinking, Iran and Putin said that we have to separate the nuclear deal from the ballistic deal. So to what extent the Americans are going to care about the tools available in the region if they're going to sit and negotiate. David Siniker, he is about to recognize Houthis. Is he going to recognize their presence? Is Iran waiting for a prize? Is it thinking that it is going to be recognized by the West as a regional power similar to the Turks? Or is the situation going to stay as it is, lifting the sanctions and keeping the siege as it used to be for 40 years? So many questions. I think that the decision is based on all these points that I mentioned. Trump and the hawks tried to move into war, but then they realized that he is not a man of war. And there are a number of groups. We have not heard the Department of Defense or CSA pushing for that. Is there going to be a new policy when it comes to dealing with Iranians? Have the Iranians been successful and the Iranians were able to overcome the sanctions? They were able to make the Americans and Saudi Arabia not to respond to matters such as the attacks and so on and so forth, was able to achieve a great deal in Syria. Can Iran, in the light of what is happening, can they impose a new kind of scenario? I think that the United States of America is assessing the Iranians differently from other countries. Even Trump, when he talks about Iranians, he talks about a great ummah, talking about the Persian ummah and an old ummah. I think that this discourse in its confrontation with the Iranians is still rational. So are they going to sit and negotiate? Are the GCC in that way going to lose everything? Is the table is going to talk only about the security of Israel? Is Iran going to give guarantees when it comes to the security of Israel? There's so many components that should be taken into account in this confrontation, but we can say foremostly that this kind of conflict is rational. So the Iranians do not want to have a comprehensive war, nor are they able to do that. And the same applies to the U.S. And maybe we're going to have a new nuclear dossier and a new agreement about it.
Shukran. So since you took less time than the others, I'm going to start with a question for you. What do you say to those, and I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate, to those who say that any kind of U.S. Iranian settlement will be to the detriment of some Arab states at least?
To answer this question, in fact, I must say that I must ask, has really USA redefined the region? The day that Aramco was attacked, Mr. Trump was delivering an election, campaign election speech. What did he say to his public? He said, in the past that would affect us. Right now it doesn't affect. We have our own petroleum. So this is the definition, the redefinition of the region. So the question is, Trump says, I'm sending armies, troops to get money, so to worth of making profits. So if USA wants to redefine the region, I think the Iranians and the Americans will sit together to negotiate for their common interests. And to a bigger question, is it the interest of USA, which is milking the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia? Is it in the interest of USA to put an end to the Iranian scarecrow? No, it's not in their interest. So, in my opinion, I'm not saying that USA is a savage country, but I think in its politics you feel as if it's a savage country. That's what I say. That's why they might go to table of negotiations for getting all the interests as other but the Israeli ones.
Thank you. So I'm gonna. What time is it? Okay. So I'm gonna ask two or three more questions, and please keep it at 3 or 4 minutes. I'm gonna intervene this time to allow for some questions, of course. Let's start with Suzanne. I mean, you said at the end that you're pessimistic about negotiations taking place. So perhaps you can elaborate on that briefly. And secondly, how is U.S. policy on Iran going to continue in the next few weeks and months? And perhaps you can also say if you think that the nuclear deal is going to collapse or not. I know, 3 questions for 3 or 4 minutes, but try your best.
I will try to be concise this time, and I apologize for starting us off on the wrong foot by exceeding my time limits. Ali was far too polite in enforcing them. But let me just say I'm pessimistic because I think that both sides believe that time is on their side. I think that the Trump administration, to the extent that we have a coherent national security bureaucracy at this stage, believes that they can continue imposing the sanctions, as I said, without any real penalty to the United States or to the global economy, and that, in effect, they're happy to see Iran under this very severe economic pressure, perhaps constraining resources to some of its regional activities, perhaps forcing the kind of tough decisions that prior rounds of sanctions contributed to, particularly with the decision in 2013 to shift the entire approach to the nuclear negotiations, which of course had been ongoing at that point for more than a decade. So I think the Trump administration doesn't feel any real constraint in terms of continuing its current approach. And I think from the Iranian perspective, and here I'm hypothesizing, of course, from a distance, there must be a sense that they have survived the worst of it. That in fact, there are some economic indicators that suggest, despite the fact the economy will contract, according to the IMF, by as much as 10% this year, that Iran's economy has stabilized to some extent, that the value of the currency has notched up a tiny bit, that inflation may be modulating, and that there hasn't been a backlash on the streets, that people, in fact, there appear to be less indications, fewer incidents of labor strikes, protests over various financial and economic issues, which at various points in time, as you well know, have been quite frequent and quite vocal. And so from the Iranian perspective, they have seen that, in fact, these attacks have generated some diplomatic momentum from Europe and elsewhere, and there will be a temptation, I'm afraid, to up the ante, to try to drive greater urgency around this issue, to try to force the Europeans to make a choice between Washington and Tehran, and to try to drive some conclusion to this interminable pressure by the United States. And I think that those two time clocks, the sense on both sides that they can perpetuate their current approach is without negotiations, is one that makes it very difficult to foresee a really viable platform for negotiations. I would add to that the fact that there just isn't a lot of capacity in Washington right now. You don't think that Trump all of a sudden will decide to strike a deal to save his presidency, or to? I don't think it saves his presidency, unfortunately. He doesn't have anything invested with Iran, quite literally, as well as diplomatically. It in no way preserves his political viability. It doesn't speak to his base. He has fulfilled his campaign promise by walking away from the Iran nuclear deal. He may have promised a bigger and better deal, but of course, nobody in the United States is going to hold him to that. He would be quite happy with a kind of photo-op diplomacy, as he had with Kim Jong-un, but it will be more difficult to implement that, given the very vocal constituencies who know the issues at stake in the nuclear deal. It will be difficult for him to simply rebrand the JCPOA as the Trump CPOA and call it a day and lift all of the sanctions. Even the Republicans on Capitol Hill would not hear for that. So what I worry about is that we have this impasse, that the United States believes its policy is working, that Iran is now beginning to believe that its policy is working, and that on both sides, this will lead to a sort of game of chicken. Who is prepared to modulate first? Who is prepared to capitulate first? Will Trump back away from his policy? Will Iran make some effort to try to comply with some of the conditions that the Trump administration has outlined in terms of changing its own approach to the region or relinquishing its expectation to continue to enrich uranium. I'm not optimistic on either of those conditions. And while I think there is capacity room, I think there's the right solution here is negotiations. It is some kind of a modus vivendi, and it's something that looks beyond the nuclear program, looks beyond the nuclear deal, that tries to address the wider array of issues at stake between the two countries. Because what we've seen over the course of the past few years, I think, will make it difficult for either side to have confidence in a small transactional bargain. The Iranians can't have confidence that the next administration will implement a deal if it only addresses a portion of the problem. And on the United States side, there won't be confidence that the region would support a deal, that the Republicans would support a deal that only addresses a portion of the problem. So I think we're back to 1979 again. We really have to have a much wider and more ambitious set of negotiations between the two countries.
Thank you, Suzanne. Abbas, you laid out why Iran sees the U.S. policy as coercive diplomacy, which was, by the way, also the case during the Obama administration. But what do you say to those who would argue that, Iran will only react to coercive diplomacy, to carrot, or to, as they put it, to carrot and sticks policy? And, or in other words, Iran will not bend under pressure, but Iran will bend under a lot of pressure. And you also, so don't you think that this, Suzanne talked about the 10% or 9% contraction of the Iranian economy and the relative stabilization, but nevertheless the economic problems are huge. So, some people would argue that sooner or later, Iran has to negotiate with the United States because the look to the East policy will not satisfy Iranian needs. So what is indispensable is to negotiate with the United States to have those sanctions lifted, which is, by the way, also heavily impacting upon Iran's look to the East orientation or ambition. So, but because you said also something, of course, very important, is that enmity is a good situation for a lot of actors. So what would you say to those who say that only pressure can change Iranian behavior?
Yes,
thank you.
I think those which they believe that they can do something with Iran, they can force Iran to negotiate, not coercively, but friendly or diplomatically. They are not familiar with Iran, Iran's history and Iran's culture, people of Iran. Yes, it is true that IMF says in recent report that Iranian economy will be shrunk 10% in next year. Yes, it is true, but 90% remains. The goal of the United States was and is to destroy 100% of Iranian economy, not, for example, 1% or 2%, which IMF says 10% contraction. As I know, Iranians, they will resist first. Second, the world is not only United States as superpower as it was after the World War II. There are many, many other opportunities which Iranians, they are exploring. For example, look at this triangle, Iran, Russia, and Turkey. They are working together without domination of dollar, and they have a lot of exchange of commodities. Many fruits from Iran goes to Russia, from Turkey comes to Iran. Therefore, the case, maybe it is in the first and second years of sanction would be with some problems, but in long term, I think it is better for Iran to have an economy independent from United States, independent from United States dollars, and it is possible. It is possible as the economists, they are talking in the Asian countries. Asian identity is very important for Iran now, and we are trying to have better relations, good relations, close relations with Central Asia, with Mongolia, with China, with South and North Korea, all of the countries. The issue of sanction also, history of sanctions says that it was 120 sanctions in all of the history. And more than 50% of these sanctions now are are imposed by United States. Therefore, if you want to do sanction 50% of the countries, it means that you cannot do that. Sometimes, for example, in 1970s, it was only and only South Africa. Sometimes Israel, yes, it was very effective. But now Russia is under sanction, Turkey, Iran, and other countries also. And the last point is that, as my friend said, that why I did not talk about Israel, Iran supports Palestine and Palestinian brothers and sisters. And Iran pays a lot of cost about this case. Iran pays a lot. The other issues which media and some experts, they are talking about the influence and $1 or $1 billion of Iran in the other countries, these are false. As we discussed now, Iran's economy cannot tolerate some donations to other countries or some groups, resistant groups or others. But Iranian revolution has this absorption that some countries or some groups, they are copying the case that Iranian they did. And we cannot say to them that don't go to Yemenis. Really, we don't support Yemenis financially or militarily. We have only one hospital in Sana'a, which was from 20 years ago. But Houthis, which they are some part of Shiites group in the world, they learned about how to resist against Saudi's forces from Iranians during Iran-Iraq war and from Syrians during the recent war.
Thank you. Since Abbas opened the Pandora's box of regional geopolitics, I'm going to ask a last question before we go to the Q&A. To Omar, given the ongoing and quite impressive and radical protests that we've seen in Iraq and in Lebanon, that were both against the sectarian elites of those countries and also the Shia populations of those countries very much, criticizing those Shia elites that are aligned to Iran. How do you think those protests going to impact upon regional geopolitics and Iran's influence? Briefly, please.
Nobody can deny. Perhaps Iran is different slightly from Lebanon, but we cannot deny that there is objection in Iraq about certain Iranian interventions. Iraq, strategically speaking, has become closer to Iran to any other country. But these protests that are taking place, whether in Iraq or in Lebanon, they are protesting on the quota system. They are protesting on sectarianism. And in Lebanon, the protests that are taking place, I cannot say that they are against Hezbollah, but they are against the Ta'if agreement and the quota system, the corrupt quota system, this sugar-coated kind of democracy. So is this going to lead to a critical mass in the two communities in order to overcome the situation? This is a question that can remain open. And up to now, I do not think that the protests can lead to a public opinion that can form a new political system that would overcome the Ta'if agreement. But there are changes happening in the region. Is this a new Arab Spring after what has happened in Algeria, Sudan, and now what is happening in those two countries? And in my opinion, that the Iranian policy, and I do agree with my colleague, that the project of the Israelis that want to exclude Palestinians, I think they make this project not very successful. But in my opinion, we have a popular position vis-à-vis the role that is being played by Iran in Iraq and in Syria and other countries, and people are divided vis-à-vis such a matter. But the question, if there are in those regions, particularly in Lebanon, that people are not happy, yes, the demonstrations were talking about Iranian and the hegemony of Iran and the militias. Is this going to be a critical mass that is going to lead to the formation of a new system? I do not think so. But Iran, in the different Arab dossiers, exists, yes, in Yemen, with all due respect. Yes, it is there with all its strength. In Syria also, inside Lebanon also, in Iraq also, and many other countries. Some welcome this role and some others see this role as being impactful on those countries, their capabilities and their tools. But geopolitically speaking, everybody is waiting for what is going to happen between the U.S. and Iran. There are so many things that are going to be revealed after the end of this conflict. So if the situation remains as it is, and Iran, if it is able to reduce the level of the sanctions, and I think that the region is going to continue in its loss. I think this region needs some settlements, and I think we need a third party. You're talking only about Iran and the U.S. Where is the region, the remaining countries of the region, the Arab countries of the region? This is a big question that should be posed, and this refers us to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that does not have a project, cannot come up with a narrative and present its narrative to the Iranians and to the U.S. The Iranians, since the Shah era and Rafsanjani, they have been asking for a settlement in the region to protect the region, that the region should protect itself by itself, to have its own internal agreements. Because why? Because there are a number of projects that impede that, and some Arabs are ready to do that.
Thank you. So now, finally, where's the mic? Okay. So, as always, I'm always trying to do some gender parity. I know sometimes it's difficult, but I'm going to try this nevertheless tonight as well. The gentleman at the back was at the front.
Thank you. Question, if I may, to Ms. Maloney. Your reaction to something that was mentioned by Mr. Asaraya. He alluded to the role that Israel plays in the Iran-U.S. relationship, and I would like to know, from your point of view, from the U.S., how do you reconcile the way that the U.S. has reacted in the past and continues to react to the perceived Iranian nuclear threat or nuclear risks, both in terms of policy and actions, versus the way that the U.S. has reacted and reacts to the nuclear developments in North Korea, where the North Koreans during the George W. Bush administration detonated nuclear bombs repeatedly, continues to do that occasionally. It has developed ballistic missiles and long-range missiles, and has massive offensive capabilities, and puts two very important Asian economies at risk, Korea and Japan. You don't hear any of that belligerent rhetoric out of the U.S. against North Korea. Never has, not only during Trump, but also during Bush and Obama.
Thanks. The gentleman in the front, please keep it as short as you can so we have more time for other questions and answers. So we're going to collect. So the gentleman here at the front.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I'd like to thank distinguished speakers. We are here actually, it's more like speculating what is actually in the mind of decision makers, basically, whether in Iran or in states, and everybody's trying to have his own interpretation. I really think the key element, we always actually, when there is a robbery, we always look who's the beneficiary if there is a crime. In terms of criminal justice, we always look, investigators, who's the beneficiary. If we look at this chaotic situation, the only beneficiary unit is Israel. If we actually see the amount of benefits that Israel has gained in the since this whole chaos started in the region, is unbelievable. It has inflated in the region in a way that it could never have anticipated. And I think if we, for one moment, just imagine that actually this tension between the United States and Iran disappears, and then the normal relationship is resumed between Iran and all these neighborhood, then I think neither Iran nor these governments in the region have any legitimacy to really have normalized relationship with Israel. And therefore, I really think that this tension will go on for unforeseeable future until actually the Israeli relationship with key Arab states is normalized to the extent that actually we'll have Israelis among us here just as much as actually we have Palestinians. And that when nobody actually talks about Palestine anymore. That is my analysis, and thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment. The lady over there.
Thank you. Mr. Al-Yasra, you said that we are unlikely to have another outcome like that of the Shah. I'd like you to expand, if you can, on the domestic politics of Iran, what's going on right now with the socioeconomic issues, and whether you think they're likely to face major protests. Thank you.
This is for Abbas. Thank you. My colleague it was. I didn't see her. Okay, so maybe another one. The gentleman over there.
I would like to thank everybody for this great speech, but I just have two questions for Mr. Abbas and for Mr. Omar concerning we stopped back in 1979 until the Islamic Revolution in Iran. But for you, Mr. Abbas, back in 1952, I think the United States, we all remember the book, or the Shah Men for Stephen Kinzer, when the United States killed the first democratic elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, during the Shah regime and the coup. That was 66 years ago. And Mr. Omar, you mentioned about the intelligence community or the CIA or any other agencies which can roll in the foreign policy. As we see in the Syria crisis, what's going on down there, that the people they elect to take another opposition situation against their president, Bashar al-Assad. Then after that, the United States foreign policy, I think what's going on is going to kill another democratic elected prime minister, whoever will come. So you think, Mr. Abbas, go back in 1952 when the first democratic elected Mohammad Mossadegh, that when the start the conflict between the United States and the Iranian people. Thank you.
So what was the question? I didn't. Okay, perhaps Abbas got it. So we're going to actually, 2 more questions, and then we just have 10 minutes for responding to all those questions in total. The gentleman here, the gentleman at the front, but please only ask questions, no more comments, please, and very short, please, because otherwise you're not going to hear the answers.
My question is for Dr. Maliki. First of all, kheli mamnoon, khosh amadi. The impact long-term on the energy sector in Iran, upstream, downstream, midstream, everything of sanctions. Natural gas, there's huge reserves, but you can't export it. Oil, obviously, with sanctions and everything. What's the long-term economic impact on the oil and gas sector in Iran?
Thank you. All those questions, big questions. Here, the professor here.
Thank you. In both presentations by Dr. Abbas Maliki and Suzanne Maloney, there was part of it was basically arguing, if I didn't get this wrong, that neither side sees it in their interests to push for any kind of breakthrough, that they're both, in different ways, both seem to be saying that, well, the status quo is fine, there's no real incentive to change. But then how is that matched with these apparent attempts to get a dialogue going, which seem to be more than cosmetic? I mean, Suzanne seemed to be indicating, well, it's kind of cosmetic, it's not real. But at the same time, there was this episode where Trump was not only willing to go along, waiting in a room when Macron tried to set this up, but was actually talking and really vigorously discussing with his own people the possibility of dropping sanctions. That seems to indicate it's slightly more than cosmetic. And at the other, in the case of Dr. Abbas, there is the statement you said that there's actually very substantive progress being made in preparing the ground for these talks. So I just want to tease this a little bit further. You know, how is this contradiction, or is it only an apparent contradiction? But if it is a contradiction, how is it explained?
Thank you. So if there is a lady who wants to ask questions, we have a time. Sorry, you're another. Otherwise, because of time constraints, we have to go back. So we have maximum 14 minutes in general, so I'm asking everyone to pick and choose. But the questions perhaps that were posed to Abbas on the domestic situation, the socioeconomic situation, and the issue of potential protests, and the other one on the energy sector. So maybe you can respond to those. Thank you.
Me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It shows that Iran still is an important country in this region, despite of all of sanctions from United States. Regarding protest in Iran, yes, Iran is a country with different groups, layer. Middle class has been now very strong, and the higher educated people, there are a lot, more than all of the other countries in this region. And Iran is the fourth on training engineers in all of the world. And if you look at the other higher education trends, Iran's universities, they are very good. Therefore, I want to say, as other countries, Iranians also, they have rights to demonstrate, to protest if they wish. The case is that how Iranian government deal with this case. An Iranian government or Iranian administration now, they have learned that it is better to permit people to do that and to be patient. Therefore, there are a lot of protests in industrial sector, among workers, in agriculture, in universities, sometimes not this year, and it is very normal as other countries. Regarding Iran and Iraq, which we discussed before, that Iran and Iraq, they have very close relations. I want to refer to the name of these two countries in Arabic. We have Iraq Arab, Iraq Ajam. It was one unique country in the past. Therefore, it is very natural that we Iranians with Iraqis, Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds, all of them, have good relations, close relations, and recently, 2 days ago, it was a 20 million demonstration for Arba'in, the 40 days, the 40th days of martyr Imam Hussein. Therefore, it is not very strange. The case of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, really, I want to say, despite of all of these historical issues, Iran is ready to have a natural and normal relations with the United States. I have lived in the United States, and the commonalities between Iranian society and United States, there are a lot of commonalities. Even in the formation and design of cities and something like that. From 1850, which Iran and United States, they established embassies in each capital, until 1953, the name of United States in Iran was the Third Force. Third Force means not Britain, nor Russia or Soviet Union. The Third Force, which Iranians, they had a lot of expectation from United States. But after the coup against Dr. Mossadegh, United States felt that it is better to see Iran as a rentier state and United States as dominant power in this country with rich oil, on that time, oil resources. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 was a reflex of this issue, the case of the interference of United States inside of Iran more than as it is natural in the diplomatic corps. This is the most important factor in the Iranian Revolution. And after that, unfortunately, we could not reach to a normal situation with the United States. But I can say Iran is ready to have a normal situation with Washington, D.C., not rentier, not colonial, something like that, as two countries they have. The case.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we're running out of time because we just have 5-6 minutes.
I wanted to talk about energy, which
I'm sorry.
Professor in energy.
Suzanne, maybe you can also respond to Professor Hart-Noneman's question in terms of, I mean, it seems that, so are we going to see the continuation of enmity? But what is, but does it, inherently has the potential for escalation or not?
Thanks. I will go very quickly, but I want to say a word or two just about the North Korea question. In fact, this administration, the Trump administration, has been very hostile to North Korea. In the first year of the Trump administration, there were serious, and I'm told, very urgent concerns about the prospect of military action involving North Korea, which would have been catastrophic for all of Asia. And so this is certainly a case where the Trump administration has exerted a lot of fire and fury, both in tweet and in reality. And frankly, it is the specter of the agreed framework, an arms control agreement negotiated by the Clinton administration with Pyongyang, which the North Koreans later violated and effectively then raced to the bomb, that motivates some of the criticisms of the JCPOA. This is why they want, the critics want a much stronger agreement. A word just I have to say about 1953. The United States played a role for which it has apologized, along with Britain, which has never apologized, along with many Iranians, who were, of course, the actual executors of that action. And the primary reason why Iran is not a democracy today is not Washington's fault. It's the responsibility of the Islamic Republic. And frankly, today Iran has a president who is talking openly about the need for a referendum on the future of the Islamic Republic, and that would be the best path to honoring the legacy of Mossadegh and Iran's long aspirations for true democracy. In terms of diplomacy, I am pessimistic, but not because I don't believe it's possible, because I believe it's necessary, but because I don't have much confidence in the leaderships on either side. But let's be clear, the United States spent 6 months after the seizure, while our diplomats were being held in Tehran and in many cases being abused, the United States did not cut off relations with Iran until April of 1980. Every American president has sought to engage directly with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and for, frankly, much of the past 40 years, it's been Tehran that was unwilling to engage with Washington. I think it is mercurial, to put it politely, as this current American president is. There is a huge benefit to the future of any relationship between the two countries that he has not, as President George W. Bush once tried, sought to cut off any kind of dialogue or delegitimize the idea of dialogue with Iran. The fact is, we have a president who will sit in a room waiting for a call from his Iranian counterpart. But what he won't yet do is, I think, put any real serious concessions on the table until and unless he sees serious concessions from the Iranian side. And we don't, unlike in Iran, have a serious effort in this, I can speak with some confidence, to try to devise the framework for negotiation with Iran under the current circumstances. There may be some willingness from the president's side, but there hasn't been the kind of bureaucratic preparation that went into the nuclear negotiations that culminated in the deal, first in 2013 and then in 2015.
Omar, if you have any closing thoughts.
يعني أنا بديش أطول كثير بس أنا برأيي إنه إيران
won't be long, but I think as people in Gulf said, Iran has become a real regional power. So with the American negotiate with them, in 2000 they did go into negotiations with them and there was this nuclear deal. But animosity continued to be between the two countries, and they are not. And the reason is that the allies of USA are afraid of Iran, afraid of strong Iran, Iran that has some external ambitions and for its relationship with its Palestinian cause. And this is not a political fear. Israel and some of the allies in the Gulf are a sort of sick, a natural sort of fear, a natural one. So Israel is an important factor. Israel is afraid not only from Israel, but from any development in any Arab country. That's why there will always be this conflict. Shukran.
All the panelists, to Mara Yasra, to Dr. Abbas Maliki, to Dr. Suzanne Maloney, and to all of you for tonight. I hope we were able to a bit shed light on a very complex and multifaceted topic. But I hope that our panelists are right. There's going to be no escalation or major military escalation, and hopefully we're going to see some détente. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.